Queen Nzinga was born into the heart of a kingdom in crisis. As a young princess, her world was shaped by the shifting tides of power and the threat of European colonization. Her birthplace, the Kingdom of Ndongo, was a land situated on the western coast of Africa, in what is modern-day Angola. This region was a crossroads of cultural, economic, and political influence. Yet, it also stood at the precipice of an existential struggle. The Portuguese, who had arrived on the African continent in the late 15th century, were growing bolder, expanding their trading posts and settlements along the coast. For Ndongo, their presence was both a challenge and an opportunity. The Portuguese wanted to exploit the kingdom's wealth, control the region's slave trade, and disrupt the social order, while the indigenous people, led by the powerful kings and queens of Ndongo, sought to preserve their sovereignty and way of life. Nzinga's early life unfolded in the midst of these tensions. Her father, King Ndongo, was a ruler caught between tradition and the encroaching power of the Portuguese. Mbandi's reign was defined by ongoing struggles against the European colonizers who were steadily advancing their economic and military foothold. By the time Nzinga entered her adolescence, the kingdom was deeply entangled in the politics of resistance. Her father's diplomatic skills had kept Ndongo's relations with the Portuguese somewhat balanced, but there was a growing realization that the kingdom would have to either yield to Portuguese demands or fight for its freedom. Nzinga, like her people, understood that the stakes were high, not only for the survival of Ndongo, but for the future of its people. Nzinga's early education was shaped by the experiences and struggles of her father's court. As a princess, she would have been tutored in the arts of diplomacy, strategy, and leadership, all essential for the role she would later play. Yet it was her mother, a woman of notable influence, who likely provided the foundational values that would guide Nzinga's future decisions. At a time when African women's political power was often overshadowed by their male counterparts, Nzinga's mother played a significant role in shaping the kingdom's cultural and political framework. This early exposure to the complexities of leadership and power dynamics set the stage for Nzinga's later actions, when she would rise above the constraints of conventional gender roles and emerge as one of the most formidable and visionary rulers in African history. As a young woman, Nzinga's beauty, intelligence, and cunning were already evident to those around her. Yet, it was her growing awareness of the situation in Ndongo that would sharpen her resolve. The Portuguese were expanding their influence, forging alliances with rival kingdoms, and exploiting the turmoil within Ndongo to strengthen their position. The king of Ndongo, Nzinga's father, had been faced with Portuguese demands for tribute, trade rights, and the establishment of forts. These demands were not just diplomatic in nature. They were an assertion of Portuguese authority over African lands, an attempt to impose a new colonial order on indigenous peoples. The Portuguese were skilled in the art of negotiation, using gifts, promises, and threats to undermine the kingdoms they sought to dominate. It was in this turbulent environment that Queen Nzinga's rise to power began. When her father's health began to falter, the Portuguese saw an opportunity to gain more leverage. Nzinga's father had long been a thorn in the side of Portuguese imperial ambitions, refusing to bend to their demands and striving to maintain his kingdom's autonomy. But the king's death left a power vacuum, one that threatened to undo the delicate balance of power between the Portuguese and the kingdom. It was then that Nzinga, still a young woman, emerged as a central figure, stepping forward to assume the leadership of Ndongo at a time when her people were desperate for a strong, determined ruler to challenge the Portuguese on their terms. When the Portuguese emissaries arrived at the royal court to negotiate with the new ruler of Ndongo, they were met with an extraordinary display of both strength and intelligence. Nzinga, recognizing the gravity of the situation, refused to cower or be intimidated by the European diplomats. At the negotiation table, she stood resolutely, her poise and demeanor speaking volumes about her resolve. She was not merely a princess. She was the representative of a people who refused to submit to the tides of European conquest. However, the negotiation began on a tense note. The Portuguese ambassador, the governor of Angola, came with an air of superiority, treating the newly ascended ruler of Ndongo with little respect. The defining moment came when the Portuguese insisted on speaking with her in a manner that reflected their belief in their superiority. In the tradition of diplomatic meetings, the Portuguese envoy sat on a high chair, and Nzinga was expected to kneel before him. Instead of acquiescing, Nzinga responded with sharp wit and diplomatic ingenuity. She had a servant kneel in her place, using the act as a symbol of her defiance. In that single moment, she conveyed a powerful message to the Portuguese. She would not submit to their authority, nor would she allow her kingdom to be treated as a mere colony. The audacity of this act would become a defining feature of her legacy. Nzinga had turned the negotiation table, quite literally, into a platform for resistance. Nzinga's quick thinking and bold leadership soon earned her the respect of her own people, as well as the fear and admiration of the Portuguese. Her willingness to challenge their authority was unprecedented. This moment of defiance set the stage for a series of diplomatic and military maneuvers that would see her rise to power. But it was not simply her courage that made Nzinga a great leader. It was her ability to read the political landscape, anticipate the moves of her enemies, and use her intelligence to outmaneuver those who sought to dominate her people. As queen, Nzinga would face the overwhelming challenge of managing a kingdom caught between the forces of European imperialism and the resistance movements within Africa. The Portuguese would continue to apply pressure, seeking to turn Ndongo into another colony. But Nzinga, with her sharp intellect and deep understanding of both African and European political systems, would craft a strategy of resistance that would span decades, forever altering the trajectory of her kingdom and of African resistance against colonial domination. Her reign would not be defined by mere confrontation, but by her ability to navigate the complex interplay of power, diplomacy, and warfare. Nzinga's early experiences, forged in the fires of a kingdom under siege, would lay the foundation for a legacy that would continue to inspire generations. Her defiance at the negotiation table was not an isolated event. It was a declaration of war, a commitment to the defense of her people and her culture. Nzinga's story began with a single, powerful act of resistance, but it would unfold into a saga of defiance, strategy, and survival against colonial powers that sought to erase the identity of the African continent. The first chapter of Nzinga's journey was one of courage and intelligence, of realizing the weight of her heritage and the duty she had to uphold the dignity of her people. It was in this moment that Nzinga emerged not just as a ruler, but as a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. This was the beginning of a legacy that would transcend the borders of Ndongo, one that would stand as a testament to the resilience of African leadership in the face of colonial oppression. The world would come to know Nzinga not just as a queen, but as a leader who dared to rewrite the rules of engagement with colonial powers. The death of Nzinga's father marked not only the end of an era for the kingdom of Ndongo, but also the beginning of an extraordinary struggle that would shape the future of the kingdom and its people. With the Portuguese Empire lurking on the edges of African sovereignty, Nzinga faced an immediate challenge. The transition of power in Ndongo was no simple matter. Despite her earlier display of political savvy, she was not automatically accepted by all factions of the kingdom, and the intricate dance of diplomacy and military power that would follow would prove to be far more complex than a mere contest of wills. Upon ascending to the throne, Nzinga inherited a kingdom beset by internal division and external threat. The Portuguese were not the only force threatening Ndongo's sovereignty. There were rival African kingdoms that had either been drawn into Portuguese alliances or sought to exploit Ndongo's vulnerability in the wake of the king's death. The political landscape was treacherous, and Nzinga's enemies were not just Europeans, but also ambitious local rulers who saw an opportunity to expand their own territories at Ndongo's expense. Despite the challenge of external and internal pressures, Nzinga knew that the survival of her kingdom depended on the alliances she could forge and the military might she could summon. Her leadership was not simply a matter of birthright, but of a strategic acumen that far exceeded what many had expected from a woman, especially one in such a precarious position. With this in mind, Nzinga sought to consolidate her power both at home and abroad. She turned to the only political tool that seemed to hold the potential to tip the scales in her favor: alliances. Her first step was to forge ties with neighboring kingdoms, seeking to create a united front against the Portuguese and their local collaborators. Yet, these alliances were not easily won. Nzinga, as a woman in a patriarchal society, faced unique challenges in convincing other African rulers to unite with her. The prevailing norms of the time dictated that women could not hold military command, much less lead a kingdom into battle. But Nzinga was a master strategist. She didn't seek to break these norms outright. Rather, she worked within them, finding ways to use the strength of her alliances to bolster her authority while proving her capabilities on the battlefield. She also knew that her people needed more than just political maneuvering. They needed to feel the strength of her leadership in practical terms. One of her first acts as queen was to shore up the kingdom's defenses. Nzinga ordered the construction of fortifications, the recruitment of soldiers, and the training of local militias. Her ability to mobilize the people of Ndongo was crucial to the kingdom's survival. While the Portuguese had the advantage of superior weaponry and an established military presence, Nzinga's knowledge of the terrain, her people's fierce loyalty, and her military innovations leveled the playing field to some extent. She had witnessed firsthand the horrors wrought by the Portuguese and understood that only a unified and prepared kingdom could withstand their growing might. Yet diplomacy and military fortifications were not enough to ensure Ndongo's independence. The Portuguese, emboldened by their earlier successes in other African territories, pressed on with their strategy of expansion. Portuguese traders and soldiers began to establish forts along the coast, using their military presence to intimidate African kingdoms and secure valuable resources. The crown's immediate objective was the control of the rich trade in slaves, ivory, and other goods, which had become increasingly profitable as European demand surged. For the Portuguese, Ndongo was a critical piece in the puzzle of African colonial expansion. Nzinga, fully aware of the Portuguese threat, sought to use the same means they used to establish dominance: intelligence, diplomacy, and military power, but in a way that would subvert their plans. At the negotiation table, she demonstrated the same shrewdness that had characterized her initial encounter with the Portuguese emissaries. Nzinga's skills as a negotiator were quickly recognized. She understood that the Portuguese were not just military invaders. They were traders, political agents, and diplomats who had learned to blend diplomacy with military aggression. She, too, would employ these tactics, leveraging her position as a queen to establish a series of advantageous treaties and agreements with other African kingdoms and foreign powers. Nzinga's brilliance lay not just in her ability to broker deals, but in her recognition of when such deals were no longer enough. She knew that the Portuguese would not easily back down, and the diplomatic route, while essential, would eventually give way to military confrontation. Nzinga began to organize the kingdom's forces for war. It would be a long and grueling campaign, one that would stretch her leadership to the limits of endurance and vision. One of the greatest tests of Nzinga's resolve came when she faced the Portuguese forces directly in the field. The Portuguese, having established their strongholds, had already begun to move their forces inland. Their presence was more than a mere military occupation. It was a clear message to Nzinga and her people that their resistance would not be tolerated. As the Portuguese forces began to march towards Ndongo, Nzinga knew that time was running out. The kingdom's survival depended on her ability to outmaneuver the invaders and strike at their weaknesses. In the early days of the conflict, Nzinga took a measured approach, waiting for the right moment to strike. She knew that her forces were no match for the well-equipped Portuguese army in open battle. Instead, she relied on guerrilla tactics, using the dense forests and swamps of the region to her advantage. Her forces, composed largely of local militias and soldiers, were quick, agile, and deeply familiar with the terrain. They knew how to move silently, how to ambush an enemy, and how to disappear into the landscape when the situation became too dangerous. Nzinga's strategy was not simply to repel the Portuguese, but to force them into a war of attrition. She knew that the Portuguese were far from home, and their supply lines were vulnerable. By making the cost of their occupation unbearable, she hoped to force them to reconsider their campaign. Her intelligence network, which included local spies, traders, and allies within Portuguese ranks, helped to gather information on the invaders' movements and weaknesses. This intelligence gave her an edge, allowing her to strike at the most vulnerable points in the Portuguese strategy. The struggle for Ndongo was not just a military campaign, but a battle for survival and identity. Nzinga's vision was not simply to defend her kingdom from foreign invaders, but to protect the cultural heritage and dignity of her people. For Nzinga, this was not a war of territorial conquest. It was a fight for autonomy, for the right of her people to live free from foreign domination. She was not just a monarch. She was a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for those who rejected the idea of subjugation. As the war escalated, Nzinga's leadership became more evident. Her military tactics were complemented by a growing network of alliances with other African rulers, as well as diplomatic overtures to European powers who were either neutral or opposed to Portuguese expansion. Nzinga understood that the key to defeating the Portuguese was not just military might, but the ability to create a coalition of forces capable of challenging the Portuguese empire on multiple fronts. Her ability to navigate this complex web of diplomacy and warfare was a testament to her political acumen. Through each challenge, Nzinga's determination never wavered. She had become a monarch whose commitment to her people and their freedom defined every decision she made. Her reign would prove to be a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds, and the profound strength that can emerge from a single individual's unwavering resolve. The kingdom of Ndongo, though under constant threat, was far from defeated. With Nzinga at the helm, its fight for survival would continue, and its story would resonate through the annals of history as one of defiance, perseverance, and the triumph of spirit over adversity. The war against the Portuguese was not only a test of military strategy, but a battle of wills, a struggle that defined the trajectory of Nzinga's leadership and the future of the Kingdom of Ndongo. With each passing month, the confrontation between the African resistance and the European invaders became more intense, more personal. Nzinga's tactics, honed through years of observing the dynamics of power, diplomacy, and resistance, evolved alongside the shifting tides of the war. What began as an immediate reaction to the Portuguese occupation grew into a prolonged, multifaceted struggle for sovereignty. It became clear that the Portuguese would not simply pack up and leave. They were determined to break the will of the African kingdoms, to impose their colonial vision with force and manipulation. But Nzinga, unbowed by the challenges, rose to meet them, not just as a warrior queen, but as a stateswoman whose strategic brilliance and unyielding resolve would reverberate far beyond the borders of Ndongo. In the early days of her leadership, Nzinga's resistance to the Portuguese had been largely defensive. The kingdom, under her command, had concentrated on holding back the Portuguese advance and preventing their fortifications from spreading deeper into the interior. The guerrilla tactics that had served her well were beginning to have an effect, but they were not enough to dislodge the Portuguese from their strongholds along the coast. The Portuguese were heavily entrenched, their resources seemingly endless, and their military discipline unparalleled. Despite this, Nzinga understood that the war could not be won by force alone. If the Portuguese were to be defeated, their superiority in arms had to be countered by ingenuity and a combination of military, psychological, and diplomatic strategies. Nzinga knew that she needed to press her advantage, not just in battle, but in the way the war was framed, the way the world saw it. She was fighting not just for land, but for recognition, for the legitimacy of her rule. The Portuguese were keen on portraying her as a rogue monarch, someone who defied the natural order of things, a woman who overstepped her bounds. But Nzinga was careful not to allow her enemies to define the terms of the struggle. She projected her kingdom's cause as one of self-determination, a fight for freedom and dignity. This, she knew, would win her allies not just among the African kingdoms, but also among the Europeans who were not yet fully committed to Portugal's colonial ambitions in Africa. She made calculated moves to solidify her position both at home and abroad, showing her people and the world that she was not merely fighting a personal battle against the Portuguese. She was leading a collective struggle for survival. One of her first diplomatic maneuvers was to seek help from the Dutch. The Dutch, who had their own ambitions in Africa, were engaged in a long-running rivalry with the Portuguese, and Nzinga understood that an alliance with them could shift the balance of power. The Portuguese had, for decades, established a strong monopoly over the transatlantic slave trade, controlling much of the region's commerce and wealth. The Dutch, however, were beginning to challenge Portuguese hegemony, and Nzinga saw an opportunity to leverage this rivalry. She sent emissaries to the Dutch colonies, opening discussions about trade, military support, and mutual resistance to Portuguese colonialism. The Dutch, recognizing the political and military potential of such an alliance, agreed to support Nzinga, though their interests were not entirely altruistic. Their involvement in the region was motivated by their own commercial ambitions, but it was nonetheless a significant turning point. The alliance not only bolstered Nzinga's position militarily, but also sent a powerful signal to the Portuguese that they could no longer operate with impunity. Nzinga was no longer a lone queen struggling against an overwhelming foe. She had secured an international partner that could provide military technology, resources, and a degree of political legitimacy. This was a decisive moment, one that would define Nzinga's leadership and strategic trajectory of the war. The partnership with the Dutch brought with it both opportunities and challenges. While Nzinga gained access to advanced weaponry and logistical support, the Dutch demanded certain concessions, particularly in trade and resources. Nzinga, ever pragmatic, negotiated these terms carefully. She understood the delicate nature of her position, knowing that an overly dependent relationship with the Dutch could lead to a new form of colonization. She was not willing to cede control of her kingdom or her people, but she also knew that the war required resources beyond what Ndongo could provide on its own. The alliance, while beneficial, was a delicate balance that Nzinga would have to navigate with careful diplomacy. Despite her strategic success on the diplomatic front, the military campaign against the Portuguese continued to take its toll on the kingdom. The Portuguese, aware of Nzinga's growing influence and the strength of her alliances, intensified their efforts. They launched a series of counterattacks, seeking to break the back of the resistance. But Nzinga's military tactics, grounded in both indigenous African warfare traditions and European military innovations, continued to evolve. She understood that she could not afford to confront the Portuguese in open battle without overwhelming odds in her favor. Thus, she continued to rely on ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run tactics that wore down the Portuguese forces over time. One of the key elements of Nzinga's military strategy was her ability to maintain the morale of her people. She was not just a queen leading soldiers. She was a symbol of resistance, a living embodiment of the kingdom's struggle for freedom. Her leadership inspired both warriors and civilians alike, who saw in her a figure of unyielding strength. She became known for her courage on the battlefield, leading troops in a battle and standing alongside them in the thick of the fight. Her ability to inspire and rally her people became legendary. Nzinga's unwavering resolve and her determination to fight for the survival of her kingdom were not only strategic assets. They were the very heart of the resistance. Nzinga's commitment to her people was also demonstrated in her treatment of prisoners of war and captives. Rather than seeking to humiliate or brutalize those captured in battle, Nzinga extended an offer of mercy and integration. She understood that in war, it was not just the victory on the battlefield that mattered. It was the ability to retain the moral high ground, to ensure that the people of Ndongo could retain their dignity and humanity even in the face of the harshest circumstances. Her humane treatment of prisoners and captives, combined with her strong sense of justice, earned her a reputation not only as a fierce warrior, but also as a fair and just ruler. Her leadership became a beacon of hope for those under Portuguese occupation. Yet, The war was not without its setbacks. There were times when Nzinga's forces were pushed to the brink, and it seemed as though the Portuguese might finally break the resistance. During these moments of crisis, Nzinga's strategic foresight and her ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances proved invaluable. She shifted tactics when necessary, redefined alliances, and drew upon every ounce of her military and diplomatic expertise. No matter how dire the situation, Nzinga never wavered in her commitment to the cause. By now, it was clear that the struggle for Ndongo's freedom was more than just a military conflict. It was a broader symbol of resistance against colonial subjugation. Nzinga's leadership had become emblematic of the broader African struggle against European imperialism. Her ability to fight both on the battlefield and in the courts of diplomacy demonstrated a resilience that became a rallying cry for other African kingdoms and resistance movements. Nzinga's war was not just about protecting her kingdom. It was about challenging the very foundations of European colonialism in Africa. The struggle against the Portuguese would drag on for years, but Nzinga's influence continued to grow. Her tactical brilliance, diplomatic savvy, and unyielding made her not just a leader in Ndongo, but a figure of immense significance in African history. Her efforts were a testament to the power of leadership rooted in both wisdom and courage, a lesson that would echo through generations long after the conflict had ended. Nzinga's battle against the Portuguese was not just a fight for land. It was a fight for identity, for freedom, and for the future of a people whose sovereignty was worth every sacrifice. As the war between Ndongo and the Portuguese raged on, the complexities of Nzinga's leadership deepened. Every decision she made, every step she took, was a delicate balance between survival and legacy, power and principle. She was not just fighting a colonial force. She was fighting to redefine what it meant to be a ruler, a woman, and a sovereign leader in a world dominated by imperial expansion. The coming years would see Nzinga's kingdom besieged on all sides, but it would also mark a pivotal moment in the broader struggle for African resistance to European colonization. Nzinga's leadership was defined not only by her military acumen and diplomatic brilliance, but also by her ability to navigate the ever-changing political landscape. The Portuguese, despite their military superiority, were struggling to maintain their hold over Ndongo. The kingdom's resistance had forced the Portuguese to continually adjust their strategy, and this shifting momentum presented Nzinga with both challenges and opportunities. While the Portuguese were preoccupied with maintaining their outposts and fortifications, Nzinga used this time to consolidate her power within Ndongo, ensuring that her rule was firm and her people united in purpose. But there were cracks in the kingdom's unity that needed to be addressed. Nzinga's rise to power had not been universally accepted, and some factions within Ndongo were still skeptical of her leadership. There were those who questioned the legitimacy of her reign, especially given the traditional norms that placed men at the forefront of warfare and governance. Nzinga knew that her authority was not just about defeating the Portuguese. It was about proving her worth to her people, both in battle and in governance. To solidify her leadership, she worked tirelessly to strengthen internal alliances, engaging in a series of negotiations with local chiefs and leaders who had yet to fully commit to her cause. Her efforts to unify her kingdom were met with varying degrees of success. While some of the regional rulers saw in her a powerful and capable leader, others remained hesitant, unwilling to place their trust in a woman. Yet, Nzinga was unrelenting. She understood that the strength of her kingdom lay not just in its ability to resist the Portuguese, but in its ability to present a united front against the myriad forces that sought to fracture it from within. She worked to forge a new sense of collective identity, one that transcended individual ambitions and rivalries. By positioning herself as a leader who could protect the interests of all, she gradually won over the dissenters, proving that her leadership was not only effective but essential for the survival of the kingdom. Internally, Nzinga also sought to restore the confidence of her people. The prolonged conflict had taken its toll, and the people of Ndongo were weary. Many had lost family members in the fighting, and resources were becoming increasingly scarce. Yet, Nzinga's presence remained a source of inspiration. She visited the villages, addressed the concerns of her people, and personally ensured that the war effort was supported on all fronts. Her leadership was not distant or detached. It was intimate and deeply involved in the day-to-day struggles of her people. She knew that to defeat the Portuguese, she needed more than just soldiers. She needed the will of the people, their unwavering commitment to the cause. On the battlefield, Nzinga continued to innovate and adapt. Her earlier successes in guerrilla warfare had given her forces the upper hand in certain skirmishes, but the Portuguese were relentless. Their fortifications along the coast were becoming increasingly difficult to dislodge, and they were growing bolder in their attempts to push deeper into Ndongo territory. Nzinga's forces, though loyal and battle-hardened, were limited in both number and resources. Yet, she continued to leverage the kingdom's natural advantages, using the terrain to her advantage and conducting lightning raids that struck at the Portuguese where they were weakest. Her knowledge of the land, her ability to move swiftly and unpredictably, and her mastery of military tactics kept the Portuguese on edge. In her quest to maintain momentum, Nzinga began to shift her strategy. While the Portuguese were entrenched along the coast, Nzinga saw an opportunity to strike at their supply lines and disrupt their communications. She knew that the Portuguese relied on a steady stream of goods, men, and information to maintain their grip on the region, and cutting off these supplies would cripple their ability to sustain their occupation. Nzinga's forces launched a series of raids that targeted Portuguese caravans and trade routes, crippling their ability to resupply. These actions not only weakened the Portuguese military position, but also undermined their confidence, sending a clear message that Ndongo was not easily subdued. Nzinga's understanding of warfare was not limited to military tactics alone. She was keenly aware of the psychological aspect of battle. As the war dragged on, she recognized the importance of maintaining the morale of her people and destabilizing the resolve of the Portuguese. The Portuguese had long been accustomed to treating African kingdoms as inferior, assuming that their military might and technological superiority would be enough to break any resistance. Nzinga, however, was a master of psychological warfare. She understood the power of propaganda and perception, and she used her diplomatic channels to spread word of the growing resistance, painting a picture of Ndongo as a kingdom united under a strong and capable leader. At the same time, she sought to exploit divisions within the Portuguese ranks, encouraging dissent and highlighting their failures to their European allies. One of Nzinga's most powerful moves came when she established a network of spies within Portuguese-controlled territories. These spies, many of whom were local Africans who had been forced into Portuguese service, provided Nzinga with critical intelligence about Portuguese movements, plans, and weaknesses. This network of informants gave Nzinga a unique advantage, allowing her to anticipate Portuguese strategies and respond with precision. In a world where information was often the most valuable commodity, Nzinga's ability to gather and utilize intelligence became one of her greatest strengths. It also demonstrated her deep understanding of the complex interplay between military action and information warfare. Yet, despite the numerous successes of her forces, the war was taking its toll on the kingdom. The Portuguese, while unable to break the resistance, were not easily defeated. They continued to press on, sending reinforcements and establishing stronger fortifications along the coastline. Nzinga's ability to sustain the fight, while remarkable, was not without its limits. The kingdom's resources were dwindling, and the people were growing fatigued from years of conflict. Nzinga knew that, if the war were to end in victory, she would have to take bold steps to decisively weaken the Portuguese hold on the region. It was at this juncture that Nzinga's diplomatic and military strategies intersected in one of the most daring moves of her reign. Having cultivated alliances with various African kingdoms and foreign powers, she sought to broaden her alliances even further. She reached out to the French, who were also in competition with the Portuguese for control of trade routes and territories in Africa. Nzinga's message was clear. The Portuguese must be removed, and she would do whatever it took to rally support for this cause. Her diplomacy with the French was pragmatic, driven not by ideological alignment, but by the need to weaken the Portuguese and create a multi-front resistance. Nzinga's relationship with the French, like her earlier dealings with the Dutch, was marked by caution. While she welcomed their support, she knew that relying too heavily on foreign powers could lead to a loss of independence. She deftly navigated this relationship, ensuring that the French saw the strategic value of aiding Ndongo without ever becoming fully entangled in its internal affairs. She was a queen who understood that alliances were tools to be wielded, not chains to be worn. As the war continued, Nzinga's reputation as a leader grew not just within Africa, but in Europe. She became a symbol of African resistance, a powerful counterpoint to the narrative of European dominance. Her ability to navigate the complexities of war, diplomacy, and leadership made her a force to be reckoned with. While the struggle for Ndongo was far from over, Nzinga had shown that a determined, visionary leader could stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful colonial empire of the time and emerge not only unbroken, but stronger. Her journey was one of resilience, cunning, and a relentless commitment to her people's freedom, an enduring legacy that would inspire generations long after the war ended. As the years of war between Ndongo and the Portuguese dragged on, Nzinga's leadership became increasingly defined by her ability to adapt and persevere. The kingdom, though resolute in its resistance, was showing signs of strain. The prolonged conflict had depleted both its resources and its people. Yet, through it all, Nzinga never wavered in her determination to secure the sovereignty of her kingdom. If anything, the hardships of war had hardened her resolve, further cementing her position as a leader of unmatched strength and strategic brilliance. However, even in the midst of military and diplomatic victories, Nzinga had to face the growing reality that her fight against the Portuguese was not just one of armed resistance. It was also a struggle for legitimacy on a world stage where European powers were increasingly defining the rules of engagement. In the first few years of her reign, Nzinga had focused on consolidating power within her kingdom, securing alliances, and disrupting the Portuguese foothold along the coast. Yet, as the war wore on, it became clear that no matter how many battles she won or alliances she forged, the Portuguese would not easily relinquish their hold. They were far from giving up. Their superior resources, military training, and naval power were formidable, and despite the constant setbacks they faced, they remained entrenched in their positions. Nzinga understood this better than anyone. If she were to maintain the resistance and avoid complete subjugation, she would have to think beyond mere military confrontation. This realization led her to broaden her strategy, understanding that in order to achieve ultimate victory, she would need to shift the entire balance of power in the region. Nzinga recognized that, though she had made significant strides in weakening Portuguese control over the interior, the heart of the struggle lay in the coastal strongholds. To truly break the Portuguese grip, she would have to target their ability to control trade and resource flow in and out of Angola. The Portuguese thrived off their ability to exploit the region's wealth, and if Nzinga could successfully disrupt these channels, it would not only cripple their military capabilities, but also diminish their political will to continue the fight. The question was no longer simply about defeating the Portuguese army. It was about undermining the economic and strategic foundation of their entire presence in Africa. Nzinga's approach to this new phase of the conflict was twofold. She needed to strengthen her own kingdom's economic base while simultaneously striking at the Portuguese commercial networks. This meant that the war, while still a contest of military might, had become deeply intertwined with economics, and Nzinga needed to use all the resources at her disposal. To that end, she began to foster more robust trade relations with other African kingdoms, particularly those along the Congo River basin, who shared a common interest in resisting Portuguese expansion. Through these alliances, she was able to gain access to more arms, provisions, and manpower, thus strengthening her position in the ongoing conflict. The economic revival of Ndongo, through these new trade routes, was critical, providing a much-needed lifeline to her people, who were beginning to feel the strain of a long-standing war. However, Nzinga was acutely aware that her kingdom's ability to win the war would also depend on her ability to directly disrupt Portuguese economic activity. The Portuguese had built their empire on the backs of the slave trade, and the resources they extracted from Africa and their dominance in these sectors gave them a crucial advantage in the war. The Portuguese were heavily reliant on shipping, and the coastlines of Ndongo were vital to the Portuguese control over the region's trade routes. Nzinga realized that she could use this vulnerability to her advantage, and she began to expand her navy in earnest. Unlike many other African kingdoms, Nzinga recognized the importance of naval warfare in the context of colonial resistance. Nzinga's strategic shift toward the sea was a natural progression in her broader campaign. She had already used land-based guerrilla tactics to great effect, but now she turned her attention to the waterways that the Portuguese depended on for supply and trade. Building a fleet of war canoes, which was a striking deviation from the landlocked defense that had previously characterized her kingdom's strategy, was a bold move. The fleet was not designed to challenge Portuguese naval supremacy directly, but to disrupt the flow of goods and personnel along the coast. Using her knowledge of the rivers and coastlines, Nzinga's forces launched a series of raids on Portuguese supply ships, capturing valuable cargo and crippling their ability to maintain their operations. The strikes were devastating to the Portuguese economy. Their trade routes, which had been the lifeblood of their African enterprise, were now under constant threat. The disruption of the slave trade alone was a blow from which they could not easily recover. While the Portuguese were still able to muster military reinforcements, the economic impact of these raids sent shockwaves through their colonial infrastructure. The increased pressure on their supply lines, coupled with the ever-present threat of military engagements on land, put the Portuguese in a precarious position. They began to feel the strain of a war that had dragged on far longer than they had anticipated. Nzinga's military prowess and her ability to outmaneuver the Portuguese were further solidified during these years. As her forces disrupted Portuguese shipping lanes, she also conducted precision strikes against Portuguese forts along the coast. In many of these encounters, her forces struck quickly, using the same guerrilla tactics that had served them so well in the past. But she also incorporated siege tactics, using encirclement and relentless pressure to wear down the defenses of the Portuguese strongholds. Although she was often outnumbered, her knowledge of the terrain and her deep understanding of her enemy's weaknesses gave her forces an edge. It was a game of attrition, and Nzinga was well suited to play it. Throughout this period, Nzinga remained deeply engaged in the diplomatic and political sphere as well. Her alliances with the Dutch and other European powers had proven essential in sustaining her resistance, but she knew that these relationships were fraught with complications. The Dutch, while helpful in terms of trade and military support, were not motivated by altruism. Their involvement was driven by their desire to expand their own influence in the region, and Nzinga was careful to ensure that she remained in control of the direction of her kingdom's policies. The delicate balance of cooperation and independence required a steady hand, and Nzinga demonstrated time and again that she could navigate these complex international relations with skill and pragmatism. While the Portuguese were reeling from the effects of disrupted trade, military strikes, and internal dissent, Nzinga was beginning to shift the narrative of the war. No longer merely a resistance movement, the struggle for Ndongo had become a symbol of broader African defiance against European colonialism. Nzinga's name began to resonate far beyond the borders of her kingdom, reaching the courts of European monarchs and the halls of diplomacy. Her military victories, her alliances, and her ability to hold her ground against an imperial power had garnered respect and recognition. Nzinga had always understood the power of symbols. She knew that the war she was fighting was not just a battle for the survival of her kingdom. It was a battle for the very future of African sovereignty. Her ability to confront the Portuguese on both the battlefield and in the diplomatic arena was a testament to her profound understanding of the global dimensions of the struggle. She was fighting not only for the liberation of Ndongo, but for the dignity and freedom of all African peoples under colonial threat. By now, the Portuguese were forced to reconsider their strategy in Africa. The cost of maintaining a military occupation in Ndongo was proving too high, both in terms of resources and manpower. The kingdom of Ndongo had become a thorn in the side of the Portuguese, a symbol of resistance that could not easily be erased. Despite their continued military efforts, the Portuguese found themselves bogged down in a conflict that seemed to have no end, their grip on Angola slipping away, piece by piece. It was in this context that Nzinga's leadership truly began to shine. Her ability to survive, adapt, and ultimately force the Portuguese into a position of negotiation was a remarkable achievement that set the stage for the next phase of the struggle, one that would require not just military might, but the art of diplomacy and statecraft on an international stage. Nzinga had shown the world that African resistance was not only possible, but it could also be a powerful force capable of altering the course of history. In doing so, she not only preserved her kingdom, but also laid the groundwork for a broader, more enduring fight against colonial domination in Africa. Her journey was far from over, but with every victory, every strike, and every diplomatic maneuver, she continued to rewrite the narrative of what it meant to be a queen, a leader, and a symbol of African resilience. The battle for Ndongo's survival had evolved into something more than a conflict of military superiority. It was now a struggle for sovereignty, identity, and legacy. By this point, the prolonged resistance led by Queen Nzinga had already outlasted the Portuguese expectations. What began as a fierce but localized effort to defend her kingdom had grown into a complex and multifaceted campaign that involved not just military tactics, but diplomacy, strategy, and a deep understanding of the geopolitical landscape. Nzinga had outwitted the Portuguese on multiple fronts, yet the stakes remained high. The war, though costly, had begun to take a toll on both sides. The Portuguese were increasingly stretched thin, but Nzinga knew that she too was living on borrowed time. With every passing year, the costs of war, both in human lives and resources, mounted. The conflict had already decimated much of Ndongo's population. The constant pressure from the Portuguese forces, with their superior weaponry and naval dominance, was draining the kingdom's resources. The once thriving trade routes were now disrupted, and local agriculture had been crippled by years of constant skirmishes and military raids. Nzinga's kingdom was struggling to maintain its ability to feed its people and arm its forces. Though Nzinga's leadership had inspired a deep loyalty among her people, the brutal realities of war had started to set in. But if the war had taught Nzinga anything, it was the importance of resilience. In every battle fought, in every negotiation held, she had learned to adapt and turn setbacks into opportunities. Even as the situation became more dire, she refused to surrender to the pressures of defeat. As much as the kingdom had been stretched to its limits, so too had the Portuguese. The Portuguese imperial apparatus was far from monolithic. Beneath their military might and colonial ambitions lay their own internal fractures, from competing European powers to the economic burdens of a drawn-out war. For every victory the Portuguese had, they also had vulnerabilities. Nzinga understood that while her kingdom's military resources were limited, her intellect, her alliances, and her strategic vision could continue to pose a serious challenge to the Portuguese forces. In this phase of the conflict, the struggle became less about gaining ground on the battlefield and more about forcing the Portuguese into a situation where they would have to negotiate or at least acknowledge the cost of their occupation. She knew that if she could continue to inflict economic pain on the Portuguese, especially by targeting their most vital interests, their will to fight might break. One of the most decisive strategies Nzinga employed during this phase was the deepening of her political alliances. Recognizing the growing isolation of the Portuguese in Africa, Nzinga sought to strengthen ties with other European powers who were already in competition with Portugal. Her previous dealings with the Dutch had been fruitful, but she now turned her attention to the French and even to the English. Though these relationships were often opportunistic and driven by trade ambitions, they offered Nzinga an invaluable bargaining chip. By positioning herself as a formidable leader who could serve as a counterbalance to Portuguese power, she leveraged her position to gain political and military support. Nzinga was keenly aware of the European rivalry in Africa and exploited it to her advantage, seeking arms, supplies, and a strategic alliance that would allow her to counterbalance the Portuguese in ways that were previously impossible. Nzinga's ability to secure external support was crucial, but she was also aware of the limits of these alliances. She was no fool. She knew that European powers had their own agendas and were ultimately more concerned with their commercial interests than African sovereignty. Nzinga did not trust these powers completely, but she understood that she had to use every tool at her disposal. She was careful, however, never to allow these external powers to dictate the terms of her kingdom's future. She was a monarch, and her primary allegiance was to her people. Her diplomatic acumen was unparalleled. She understood that while the Europeans might help her fight the Portuguese, they would also be looking for leverage in exchange. Nzinga navigated these complex relationships with a deft hand, ensuring that the external support she received would not come at the cost of her kingdom's autonomy. As the diplomatic front strengthened, so too did the resilience of her forces. The raids on Portuguese supply ships, which had previously been sporadic, now became more coordinated and frequent. Nzinga's forces, though still outmatched in terms of military technology, were now equipped with better arms and artillery, courtesy of her European allies. She continued to rely on the tactics of ambush and hit-and-run operations, striking at Portuguese convoys and outposts with devastating precision. The Portuguese were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain their control over the coastal territories, and the pressure on their military forces was beginning to mount. Nzinga also understood that the true power in warfare lay not just in defeating an enemy on the battlefield, but in demoralizing them. She knew that the psychological aspect of war could play a decisive role. The Portuguese were not accustomed to fighting a protracted war in such hostile terrain. Their naval supremacy, though significant, could not shield them from the long, exhausting struggle on the ground. The logistical challenges of maintaining a prolonged campaign in Ndongo were beginning to wear on the Portuguese soldiers. Nzinga's forces, on the other hand, fought with an unyielding spirit, driven by a desire for freedom, sovereignty, and the preservation of their kingdom. It was this determination that gave them an edge in the prolonged conflict. Yet, despite her military successes, Nzinga knew that the war could not continue indefinitely. The resources at her disposal were finite, and the human toll of the war was mounting. Her people were beginning to feel the strain of a war that had lasted years longer than anyone had expected. Nzinga's ability to maintain morale among her troops was crucial. She worked tirelessly to keep spirits high, offering encouragement and leading from the front. Her leadership had become a symbol of hope, not just for the soldiers, but for the entire kingdom. The Queen was the embodiment of resistance, and her people, despite their weariness, found strength in her resolve. However, it was not just her own people that Nzinga had to inspire. In the midst of the war, other African kingdoms were watching. Many had initially been skeptical of her leadership, but as the years wore on, they began to see her as a powerful force for African resistance. Nzinga's refusal to back down against the Portuguese had earned her the respect of other African leaders, and many began to offer their support in the form of troops and supplies. Nzinga's kingdom, once isolated, was now becoming a rallying point for African unity against European colonialism. Despite the growing support from within Africa, the Portuguese were far from defeated. In fact, their presence in Angola was entrenched, and they were not ready to cede control easily. The Portuguese understood that if they lost Ndongo, they would lose their grip on the entire region. Their position was becoming increasingly untenable, but they were not willing to retreat without a fight. The stalemate continued for several more years, with neither side able to decisively gain the upper hand. Nzinga, though exhausted by the years of conflict, had emerged as one of the most skilled and respected leaders of her time. Her ability to adapt, to lead her people with vision, and to navigate the complex geopolitical landscape was remarkable. She had withstood years of Portuguese aggression, and her kingdom, though battered and bruised, had not yielded. She had proven that resistance was not just possible, It could be a force capable of shaking the foundations of European imperialism. But as the war dragged on, Nzinga knew that peace was the only path forward. The question now was how to achieve it. The military option, though effective, had reached its limits. Nzinga had to think about the long-term survival of her kingdom. The Portuguese, too, were exhausted. The war had drained their resources, and they had lost too many men to continue indefinitely. Yet, despite the fatigue on both sides, there was no easy road to peace. Nzinga would soon face her next challenge, negotiating a settlement with the Portuguese. It was a task fraught with danger, but one she would have to navigate with the same skill and wisdom that had gotten her this far. A resolution to the war was within reach, but it would take all of her diplomatic prowess and courage to secure a lasting peace for Ndongo. The outcome of this negotiation would shape the future of her kingdom and her legacy forever. The conflict between Ndongo and the Portuguese had stretched beyond a mere military struggle. It had become a war of endurance, where every strategic move, every battle, and every alliance forged or broken seemed to be part of a broader, ever-expanding narrative of resistance. Nzinga, now a seasoned leader, found herself at a pivotal crossroads. The war, which had initially seemed like an existential fight for survival, had transformed into a complex diplomatic and military campaign. Though the Portuguese were still entrenched in parts of the kingdom, their hold was becoming increasingly tenuous, and the question of whether the war could continue at this pace had become a matter of practicality. Nzinga had always believed in the power of resistance, but over the years, she had come to realize that this struggle could not be won by military might alone. The tides of war had shifted in her favor in many ways. Her military innovations, strategic alliances, and ability to maintain morale within her people had given her an edge. However, the toll of war had begun to show its ugly side. The kingdom's resources were increasingly depleted, and the population of Ndongo, once proud and defiant, was growing weary. Families had lost loved ones, villages had been destroyed, and the constant pressure from the Portuguese, coupled with the wear and tear of a prolonged conflict, was threatening to collapse the morale of the people. The soldiers who had once fought with fire and passion now faced exhaustion, their spirits dampened by years of seemingly endless warfare. Nzinga, ever the astute strategist, knew that the war could not go on forever. It was not just her people who were weary. The Portuguese, too, were feeling the strain. The colonial forces had been unable to break the will of the kingdom, but they had not yet been broken themselves. Both sides were exhausted, and the prospects for a swift victory appeared dim. Yet, despite the exhaustion, Nzinga did not see surrender as an option. Instead, she began to entertain the idea of diplomacy, an idea she had long kept in the back of her mind, knowing that in a conflict of such magnitude, negotiations could be just as powerful as battles. But negotiating with the Portuguese would be a delicate affair. For one, the Portuguese had never been willing to recognize Nzinga as an equal. To them, she was still the African queen, the woman who defied the norms of her time, and in their minds, such a figure was not one to be taken seriously in the halls of diplomacy. In their eyes, she was little more than a rebellious queen leading a backward kingdom against the might of a European empire. Despite the setbacks they had faced, the Portuguese remained stubborn in their refusal to acknowledge the full strength of Ndongo's resistance. The notion that a woman, especially one of African descent, could stand toe-to-toe with the imperial might of Portugal was a concept they refused to accept. But Nzinga had already proven them wrong on the battlefield. The way she had turned the tide of conflict through guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, and political maneuvering had left the Portuguese increasingly frustrated. Her diplomatic alliances, first with the Dutch and later with the French, had served to isolate Portugal further in Africa, and their military, though powerful, was no longer able to suppress the growing resistance. The Portuguese, faced with mounting costs, dwindling resources, and internal dissent, were beginning to understand that negotiated peace might be the only way forward. Yet, as much as the Portuguese Empire was forced to reckon with the growing power of Nzinga's resistance, Their pride and colonial mindset made them hesitant to accept anything less than a complete victory. Nzinga, ever the pragmatist, knew that negotiating with the Portuguese would be no simple task. She understood the cultural and political dynamics at play and knew that any peace settlement would have to be framed in such a way that it would protect Ndongo's sovereignty, while also offering the Portuguese a way to save face. She also understood that diplomacy required compromise. In war, there could only be one winner, but in negotiations, both sides would have to give something up. The question was, what would the Portuguese be willing to concede, and what could Nzinga afford to give up in return? Nzinga's approach to diplomacy was rooted in the same principles that had guided her military strategy: patience, foresight, and calculated risk. She knew that the Portuguese were desperate for a resolution, but they would never be willing to acknowledge their defeat outright. To maintain their dignity, they would need to frame the peace as a mutual agreement, one that could serve their interests without acknowledging the damage their empire had sustained at the hands of a lesser power. Nzinga had learned the art of playing the long game. She was patient, methodical, and above all, willing to use the threat of continued resistance as leverage. Her position was strong, and she was ready to use that strength in negotiations. She began by sending emissaries to the Portuguese. These envoys, skilled in the language of diplomacy, were instructed to propose a ceasefire, followed by talks on a peace agreement. The offer was made with the understanding that any agreement would have to be rooted in the principles of mutual respect and sovereignty. Nzinga's emissaries emphasized that the Kingdom of Ndongo had a right to defend itself and its people, and that the continued Portuguese occupation of the kingdom was both untenable and unjust. The Portuguese, while initially resistant to the idea of peace talks, soon found themselves with little choice but to engage. The war had dragged on far too long, and the costs had become unbearable. They were no longer able to sustain their military presence in Ndongo, and the prospect of continued conflict threatened to further erode their influence in Africa. Yet, as much as the Portuguese had no choice but to consider a ceasefire, their attitudes toward Nzinga remained dismissive. The early stages of the negotiations were marked by tension and distrust. The Portuguese representatives, though under pressure, were reluctant to concede anything of value to the African queen. They believed that any concession would be a blow to their imperial pride. Nzinga, however, remained calm and composed. She understood the delicate nature of the negotiations and did not allow herself to be swayed by the Portuguese refusal to treat her as an equal. Over the course of several weeks, the negotiations grew more intense. Nzinga's ability to read the room, to understand the underlying motivations of her Portuguese counterparts, became a decisive factor. She was keenly aware of the political dynamics within the Portuguese Empire, and she knew that the Portuguese were caught between the demands of their military and their political leadership. The war had drained them, but they also feared the broader implications of a peace settlement that would grant legitimacy to an African kingdom. Nzinga's diplomatic acumen paid off when the Portuguese, exhausted from years of conflict and unable to continue the war, finally agreed to terms. The peace agreement that would be signed was not one of complete surrender, but rather a compromise. The Portuguese agreed to recognize the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Ndongo, marking a significant victory for Nzinga. In exchange, Nzinga agreed to allow the Portuguese to maintain certain commercial privileges in the region, such as limited trade routes and the continuation of their slave trade operations, though under stricter oversight. It was not a perfect agreement, and Nzinga knew that some would view it as a compromise, but she understood that the survival of her kingdom depended on it. She had outlasted the Portuguese, and now, through diplomacy, she had secured a future for her people. The peace was hard-won, and the negotiations had been grueling, but it was a testament to Nzinga's ability to adapt, to fight not just with weapons but with words, and to emerge victorious despite the odds. With the signing of the peace agreement, Nzinga had done what many believed was impossible. She had secured the independence of Ndongo and shown the world that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resistance could triumph. The victory was not just hers, but a victory for all African kingdoms resisting European colonialism. It was a moment of unprecedented achievement, not just for her kingdom, but for the broader cause of African autonomy. Nzinga's legacy as a warrior, a strategist, and a diplomat was now firmly cemented in history. The peace talks were a moment of finality to the war, but they marked the beginning of a new chapter for Nzinga and her people. With the peace agreement signed and the Portuguese formally recognizing the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Ndongo, Nzinga's victory seemed both immediate and symbolic. The war that had lasted for years, one of fierce resistance, brutal tactics, and diplomatic maneuvering, had finally come to a close, at least on the terms that Nzinga had long sought. The peace settlement, while imperfect, offered her people a future that many had believed was impossible. The Portuguese were no longer in control, and the Kingdom of Ndongo was free from foreign occupation. Nzinga, however, understood that the peace was not an end in itself. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require just as much wisdom, leadership, and resolve as the war itself had. The early days following the peace were a time of reflection and rebuilding for the kingdom. The years of conflict had taken an immense toll, and the scars of war were visible in every corner of Ndongo. Villages had been razed, fields left fallow, and the population had suffered tremendous losses. For Nzinga, the first order of business was restoring the stability of her kingdom, which had been fractured by years of resistance. She had already proven her military and diplomatic prowess, but now she had to show her people that she could lead them through the fragile and uncertain period of reconstruction. Nzinga's leadership had been tested in countless ways during the war, but now, with peace in hand, she faced a different set of challenges. The Portuguese had left behind a legacy of exploitation, one that had permeated the entire region. Slavery, forced labor, and a system of economic dominance were deeply entrenched, and undoing this legacy would not be easy. The economy of Ndongo had been ravaged by years of conflict, and much of the wealth that had once flowed through the kingdom was now tied up in the violence of the transatlantic slave trade. Nzinga knew that she had to navigate this legacy carefully if her kingdom was to thrive in the years ahead. The people of Ndongo, weary from the long struggle, looked to their queen with hope. They had seen her lead them through the darkest of times, and they now expected her to deliver them into a new era of peace and prosperity. Nzinga, ever the pragmatist, knew that this would require careful planning and an ability to balance the needs of her people with the realities of the world around them. The peace settlement had granted her the freedom to govern, but the path forward would not be free from external pressures. In the wake of the peace agreement, Nzinga worked diligently to restore the internal stability of Ndongo. She called for the rebuilding of the kingdom's infrastructure, focusing on the restoration of trade routes, agricultural production, and the reestablishment of strong local governance. Nzinga understood that her kingdom's economic health was essential for its long-term survival. However, she also recognized that the rebuilding process would take time, and that she would need to ensure that her people felt invested in the future of their kingdom. To this end, Nzinga worked tirelessly to restore faith in the leadership of Ndongo. She met with local chiefs, elders, and other important figures from across the kingdom to ensure that the peace settlement would be respected and upheld. Her diplomatic skills were just as crucial in this phase of rebuilding as they had been during the war. She forged new alliances, not just with neighboring kingdoms, but with former enemies, seeking to create a broader coalition of African states that could support Ndongo's future prosperity. However, the peace settlement had come with its own set of compromises. The Portuguese were not willing to let go of all their interests in Africa, and despite their retreat from Ndongo, they still held significant sway in the region. While the slave trade had been disrupted by the war, it had not been eradicated, and it continued to be a powerful economic force. Nzinga's decision to allow the Portuguese some commercial privileges, especially in the form of limited trade routes, had been a practical one, but it was a delicate arrangement. The Portuguese had not completely relinquished their imperial ambitions, and their economic presence continued to exert pressure on Ndongo. Nzinga's relationship with the Portuguese remained fraught, and she knew that she would need to maintain a careful balance. While her kingdom had gained sovereignty, the global context had not changed drastically. European colonial powers were still very much invested in Africa, and Nzinga's success depended on her ability to navigate the complex international landscape. Her alliances with the Dutch and the French, once crucial to the war effort, would continue to be important in securing Ndongo's place on the global stage. However, she had learned that these alliances, though valuable, also came with their own challenges. She needed to continue to play the game of diplomacy with skill and caution, knowing that the balance of power in Africa was shifting and that the winds of change could be unpredictable. At home, Nzinga's leadership remained a beacon of hope. Her ability to unite her people, to maintain their loyalty during the war, had earned her a profound respect. But now, she had to prove that she could lead them into an era of peace, not just by managing external threats, but by restoring internal unity. The war had exposed divisions within the kingdom, and while Nzinga had managed to consolidate power during the conflict, she knew that the process of rebuilding would require continued political acumen. There were still factions within the kingdom that were not entirely loyal to her rule. Some chiefs and local leaders, though they had supported her during the war, were hesitant to fully embrace her leadership in peacetime. Nzinga knew that she could not afford to alienate any of these factions. She worked tirelessly to create a sense of national unity, emphasizing the shared struggle and the common goal of securing a prosperous future. She sought to engage in dialogue with her critics, bringing them into the fold and offering them a stake in the future of Ndongo. Her ability to compromise, to offer concessions when necessary, was one of the reasons she had been so successful during the war, and she applied the same principles to her post-war governance.